Okay, now we want to find f of g of x and g of f of x for each of these pairs. Okay, f of x equals 2 to the x, g of x equals 1 over x squared, then f of g of x equals what? Well, f of x is 2 to the x, so if we replace x by g of x, we get 2 raised to the g of x. Now, of course, g of x is 1 over x squared, so 2 raised to the g of x power is 2 to the 1 over x squared. And then g of f of x equals what? Well, g of x is 1 over x squared, so if we replace x by f of x, we get 1 over f of x quantity squared. And of course, f of x is 2 to the x, so this is 1 over 2 to the x. Okay, let's look at this one now. F of x equals x squared, g of x equals square root of x. So f of g of x equals g of x squared. And of course, g of x is the square root of x. So this is the square root of x quantity squared, which equals x. Now there's a restriction here, because g of x wouldn't be defined if x was negative. So we also have to say, well, since g of x can only work on non-negative values of x, we can't plug in g of x if x happens to be negative. So we also have the restriction on the domain of f of g of x, that x has to fit into g of x because we are doing f of g of x, which means that x has to be greater than or equal to 0. Now g of f of x is the square root of f of x, which is then the square root of what? F of x is x squared, it's the square root of x squared, and you might think that that would equal x, but it doesn't necessarily, and I'll explain why in a second. So this equals the absolute value of x. Now why is this? Well, any number can go into f of x, so your f of x can operate on any number at all, any number x at all, positive or negative. Then you're going to take the square root of that. Now, when you square a number, you're not going to get a negative, so you can always take the square root. So you're always going to have the square root of x squared, but the square root of x squared is not always equal to x because x might be negative. If x is negative 5, then x squared is 25 and the square root is 5, not negative 5. So if x is a negative number, the square root of x squared is not equal to x, is it? It's equal to the absolute value of x, the magnitude of x.